Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Never Confuse Origin with Geography, which of itself sounds a bit weird because surely the origin of a product or a component or an ingredient, whatever it is you're using, must be related to geography in some way because that component has certainly come from somewhere. And that is true, but that's about as close as we get to geography. If people say, I bought it in a particular country, or I made it in a particular country, I'm afraid none of that has anything to do with the origin that matters for customs purposes, because all of that is a geographical origin. You're describing a place where you bought it, a place where you made it, a place where you believe a component came from. And none of this has anything to do, of course, with where the ship sailed from or the plane took off from. That is not relevant. For customs, we do count those, the place of dispatch and arrival, but notice the change in terms. It's the place of dispatch and arrival. It's not actually the origin of the goods. So when we talk customs matters, we've got to talk very carefully and choose our words very carefully. Otherwise, we're not really talking about the same things. So I'm talking about the origin that has to do with the goods, the components, the ingredients, whatever it is you have, the assemblies, and why that is not the geographical place you might have thought it was. Now that is because there's more than one kind of origin. And the sort I want to talk about is called the economic origin, not the geographic origin. So we're referring to economic origin, and that is a calculated origin. Not necessarily mathematically calculated, but nevertheless worked out and calculated, and has little to do with the place that you acquired the goods. For example, I could in this very room construct a chair out of materials I have to hand. We've all been crafting lately, and that chair doesn't have to be of British origin, even though I'm sitting in England. That chair could be Norwegian, it could be American, it could be Australian. And that is what I mean by economic origin. It's got nothing much to do with place. So we have to take from our minds, if you like, delete from our minds what our colleagues might have told us and start asking some rather searching questions in order to establish economic origin of an item. And we need that economic origin to determine quite a lot of things. It has to go on a customs entry, export and import, and it might get you duty discounts if you are lucky. So it can have a big financial impact too. It might also get you locked out of certain countries because, take the Middle East, they're not very keen on items that have the Israeli economic origin. So you might not be able to get your product into a market if it has the wrong origin. Or you might be subject to quotas. Only so many of an item from that particular economic origin is allowed into a particular country. So as you can see, it can have a business limiting impact, it can have a business sort of expanding impact, and it can also have a major financial impact, either making you more expensive or cheaper than the next person's product that's the similar product. So if we don't take origin into account, we might well be wondering why things are not going so well for us when they ought to have been. Now, to make it worse, of course, everything in customs comes fairly complex, and I think origin is the most complex of any that we deal with in our consultancy and training. And origin has two different sorts. There's non-preferential origin and there is preferential origin. So not only is economic origin different to geographic, we have two sorts of economic origin. Non-preferential origin and preferential origin, non-pref and pref to their friends. Now, non-pref can determine things like labeling requirements and what origin you write down on the label on something. That's where that ruling comes from, whereas preferential origin gets you access to the duty discounts, perhaps the quotas, and perhaps the lack of access to a country. So this will come under preferential origin. Whichever origin type we're dealing with, we've said it's calculated. And that means it's calculated according to rules. Well, which rules? Well, again, complexity. We have a different rule for pref and non-pref for the same product. That's the first thing to understand. We have different rules for every single product, component, and ingredient. And you have to know their tariff code, their commodity code, in order to find the rule that applies to that particular item. So this means we have to do a lot more investigation than we might have thought before we can declare the economic origin of an item for either kind of economic origin. We must find the rule, we must apply the rule and see what it teaches us about what the actual origin is. Because when we apply the rule, we come up with an answer. And that answer is the economic origin. And it is perfectly plausible, possible, and permissible for a non-preferential origin of a product to be different to its preferential origin. So you could have something was made here in my house in England, which is made in England in a way, but under non-pref that could be made in America, and under preference it could be made in Australia. And all of those would be right answers if that was the rule that had been applied and I'd applied it correctly. So we have to have systems and processes that give us the elements we need to apply the rules, and we have to have systems and processes that allow us to have more than one economic origin for a given component, ingredient, or product. This is normal in global trade and is not unusual in any way. So we then have to ask ourselves, what kind of rules are these then that have to be calculated? Well, for non-pref and pref, the structure is very similar. And we have three types of rules that could apply to any given tariff code. Only one will apply for non-pref, but multiple ones could apply for pref. It's fun, this, isn't it, economic origin? You really need a large piece of paper, possibly a wall and a lot of post-it notes. But you've got to sit down with a pen and paper, really, to deal with this. So we're saying that the basic structure is the same in rules, but you could have a different rule for pref and non-pref for the same item, and we should accept and agree with that. And you could have a choice on preference between one or more rules, because sometimes it's either or. You don't get that with non-pref. There is the rule, the one and only rule, and that's it. So what are we going to look at then? Well, it could be a rule. The three types of rules are, it could be a change of tariff code. So that means that every component, ingredient, element, whatever it is that goes into the making of your product or assembly, you have to make a big list and write down the economic origin. Notice I said economic origin of each of the items on that list. You then have to write down the tariff code of each of the components, ingredients, and items on that list. And when you've done that for a tariff change rule, you look down the tariff codes and you look at those tariff codes for the ingredients or components, and you look at the tariff code for the finished item and compare them. So if your finished item was a tariff code beginning 8471, you would look down all of the tariff codes for your components and see if any of those began 8471. If they didn't, they were different, you will have met the rule of tariff transformation. If any of them are the same, we would then have to look to see how many digits were the same and was that acceptable or not. The likelihood is not, because the whole point of tariff transformation is all of the ingredient and component tariff codes change when you make the final item to come up with the tariff code for the final item, because that's considered sufficient transformation. The second type of rule is that a particular process must have been undertaken. So that process could be complete making up. That's used in the clothing trade. So when did your fabric turn into a jacket? That would be complete making up. Obviously, there's a definition of complete making up, but that will suffice for this afternoon. When did your fabric turn into a jacket? Wherever that happened is likely to be the economic origin place. And the third type of rule is where you not only need a pen and a piece of paper, but you need a calculator. When you then have to add to your list of components, ingredients, whatever it is you've got, not only their economic origins, their tariff codes, but you also have to add their values. And then for the valuation rule type, there's two sorts of valuation. You just knew there would be. There's two sorts of valuation. One says, look at all of those components and all of the countries that they come from, economically speaking, and let's group them together. So if we've got several bits made in China, add them together. If we've got several bits made in Pakistan, add those together. And let's look at the value of each of the countries. So add all the Chinese bits together and add their value together. Add all the Pakistani bits together, add their value together. Look at the value of all the other ones. There was just one of each country. Whichever one has the biggest value, whichever country ends up with the biggest value, is the winner. That will be the country of economic origin for your finished item. The second sort of valuation requires you to use the percentage button on a calculator, but it also requires more than just the list of components or ingredients. It now wants you to put in overheads, profit, research and development costs, list all of those down as well. So now you've got to look into the cost per item that you're making of the electricity in the factory, the heating, the lighting, the fuel used to run the machinery, the cost of the cleaners, and how much profit you're adding on. All of this needs to be listed. Now, all of those things that I call overheads and profit and research and development are said to originate, which means that whatever country this is happening in, wherever that factory might be, they're given the origin of the factory. So that's the country of their origin. They originate where the activity is taking place. Because we now have to look at our list, which is now all of these elements, each one with an economic origin, each one with a value, and we have to add it all together to come to a total that's known as the X works price of the product, the X factory price of the product. Now you might have that listed already on a price list somewhere, but you need the breakdown before we can go any further. So you either work back from your X works price or you work towards your X works price, depending on how the figures arrive for you. You might be able to get some of them from finance. So having looked at your big long list, you now have to work out for originating, which means I've got to divide my heap of countries in this long list into those which are originating physically where the factory is, and those that are not originating, nothing to do with where the factory is. This is said to be non-originating and originating. Your rule will then use a percentage, a specific percentage, and this can change with every rule. There's not a fixed percentage, and it might say 60% of your X works price is allowed to be originating, which means 40% is allowed to be non-originating. So you look at the two piles, you look at the two values you've come up with and decide if you've got 60-40. If you have non-originating 50%, then you don't originate in the country where the factory is, which is why my chair that I made in this room might not be English. It would rather depend where the components came from and if I was running that valuation rule and what their value was compared to the value of work. So you can see it's quite complicated to work out the economic origin of an item if you get a valuation rule. I suppose it's equally complicated if you have a tariff transformation rule. Maybe the easiest one is a particular process being undertaken. You just have to find out where that happened. So we have the three types of rule, and you would still have the three types for non-pref and the three types for pref. But the difference is for non-pref, only one of them can apply. The one you find next to the tariff code. There's no choice. Whereas you go to preferential trade, sometimes you get an either or, and you might be allowed maybe 2 different percentage valuation rules with different percentages. Or you might be allowed a tariff transformation and a percentage rule. So you have to look at that in a more complex way. So to do any origin, economic origin, I need a huge amount of information about my product or components, or end components in many cases. And that's the big problem. Actually doing the calculation of economic origin isn't that hard. It's gaining that information from people who might think it's on a need-to-know basis, it's commercially confidential, but they're not going to try and work out the economic origin. That's something you've got to do. So you then have to persuade them that yes, supply chain does need to know these details and that you must be given these details in order to do your work. Because doing the work of finding out the economic origin isn't optional. Non-preferential, that's non-preferential origin, applies to every single component, item, ingredient you have ever dreamt of and ever will dream of. So everything has a non-preferential origin. So you don't have a choice but to work that one out. It's needed on the customs entries. If you want to use preferential origin, where you get discounts in duty, that is optional. It's a choice. You don't have to do it. You could simply pay the full rate of duty and be done with it. Now, of course, that leads us to a consideration based on tariff code of how much duty you're going to pay in the importing country. Because there's quite a lot of work, as you can see, to gathering the information for origin, and you don't want to do that if actually there's no benefit to be had. So under preferential origin, you would only do the work if indeed you were to get a benefit. So you need to work that bit out first, and then don't bother to do the rest if there's no benefit. For example, if importing into a particular country, into America, let's say, the duty rate was already 0, then forget preferential origin. It's not going to gain you anything. But if the duty rate was 10%, it might get you 0%. So you'd be interested in doing the work then, and it would be cost effective to do the work. So we do need to give consideration to whether or not we should bother to do preferential origin. That is important before you embark upon the tricky thing of actually doing it. So if you are going to use preferential origin and you're hoping for a discount, how do you find out what the rules are and what the discount might be? Well, this is going to be by country of import. Not country of export, country of import. And to find out what that is, you've got to look at, are there any free trade agreements between your country of export and the country of import, such as between the EU and South Korea. We have a preferential free trade agreement between the European bloc and South Korea. But every country is different, and you don't know unless you look which free trade agreements, sometimes called economic partnership agreements, might have been agreed. You then have to look at those agreements and find the origin protocol, as it's known, and there it will list tariff codes, it will list the rules for each tariff code, and give you a lot of definitions, exceptions, and legal complications. But unfortunately, this is the area we're playing in. You don't get something for nothing, and you're not going to get a duty discount without working for it. That's the way these things are. So you've got to find yourself if there's a free trade agreement, and then discover if your product is listed on it. Because of course, that's the other problem. When you look at the origin protocols, it is not a list of every single tariff code there is. It's a list of selected tariff codes, which have been fiercely negotiated between the two countries involved. Now, you might start the EU-South Korea one. Well, the EU might have wanted in their first negotiation position for every product of EU economic origin to get into South Korea duty-free. South Korea would have, on the other hand, wanted to get all of their products into the EU duty-free. But each will also have been trying to protect specific industries within their countries where they don't want a sudden influx of cheap goods. So they'll have said, no, that product's not going on the list, or it's only going on the list at 50% discount. So you can't say for sure which products will be on the list by tariff code without reading the list. And that's the more complicated part of figuring this out. There is a WCO website you can use now where you can plug in your tariff code and it will help you locate free trade agreements. The UK has also got some help on that, and the EU while we still have access to it. But of course, we also will not have access to any of the EU free trade agreements from the 1st of January next year. We continue to have them this year, but from the 1st of January next year, they're gone. The UK is currently negotiating free trade agreements. You may have seen some in the press about that, and are publishing their thoughts, the outcome of the negotiations so far on the .gov website. So you can look at that to see how things are going. At the moment, we haven't got any full agreements signed as yet, but everyone is hopeful there will be quite a few signed by the end of the year, and we will still be able to get duty discounts from some of our major markets. But they too will get discounts to us. So we've got to be prepared for that. That might give us extra competition in our home market, as well as allowing us into their markets. It's a two-way street, unfortunately, but not necessarily for the same products. Economic origin is only proven, of course, by documentation. So you have the customs entry, where you put the country of economic origin in a particular field. And if it's preferential origin you want, where a discount's involved, then you have to have a special piece of paper, a particular real form. Even in this day and age, you need a real piece of paper. Very popular with Europe is the EUR1 form, and for GSP we have the Form A. Now these are real pieces of paper that have to be got to the country of import so that the customs at the country of import can see them and stamp them. At the moment it's difficult to get such real forms issued because of the lockdown and a lack of freedom to travel, and indeed we don't want to travel so much or mix so much. So special measures have been put in place in the UK where we can get those forms produced electronically. This is an exception. They are normally expected to be paper, but at the moment we can get some issued electronically with electronic signatures, and that's what we should be doing under lockdown until we are released to be able to get our real paper forms again. The EU has a system of using RECs where exporters register on their database and then they can use invoice declarations instead electronically. But that's rather fraught with problems too, and after the 1st of January we can't access that and won't be using it. So at this moment I'd like to open the floor for questions if there are any. I think you're muted, Claire.
I've unmuted your microphones. If you would like to ask a question, please do so.
No questions?
No, I'm having trouble unmuting some people.
Okay, well, that's quite encouraging, I think, that there are no questions. You must have all understood it perfectly. But I think you can see that it's quite difficult in each company to get the information to people that there's more than one origin for any given item, and that's right, not wrong. So we have to be quite persistent and do quite a bit of internal explanation, I think, with colleagues to make sure they understand what it is we're trying to achieve. This is going to make a difference from the 1st of January because the rules in any free trade agreement the UK signs with any other country will be different. They're different in every agreement. So some people are currently looking at their list of ingredients and components to see how much, if I might call it, Britishness is in that list. Because of course a free trade agreement between the UK and let's say America, you will get discounts if your item is predominantly British, according to the rules, which could again be tariff transformation, a particular process, or one of these valuation rules. So people are already starting to give consideration to where they get their items from and what the economic origin of those items is. Because that's another issue you must think about, that you might well buy the item from Germany, and you might therefore think, oh, all the components are made in Germany, it must be of German economic origin. Well, it could have been made in Britain. We can go to the shop and buy something made anywhere. Just because we get it in the UK doesn't mean it's British. So we have to start looking at our supply side. Where do all our components and ingredients come from? And what do we combine them with to produce our items, to see how we're doing if we need predominantly British things, think of the valuation, the 60-40, or it could be 70-30. How are we going to measure up? Might we be able to use that free trade agreement? Is there anything we can do today? So it's something that should be looked at. It's something that we should all be involved in the supply chain, but non-preference is not a matter of choice. Preference is. So that's the one with the discounts preference. So you need to start thinking about that and to get that knowledge into your business as best you can and start correctly evaluating your products and making sure you have the systems and processes to continue to do this. Because of course, the final kicker here is that you did all this working out today and then someone in procurement bought components from somewhere else tomorrow. And that just wrecks your calculation for all the things that are made from those products going forward. So you have to tear your calculation up and start over. How do you control that? That is often the hardest part.